Sometimes the wrong address delivers exactly the message that needs to be heard. In the shadow of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, where autumn mist clings to cedar trees like whispered secrets, Margaret Holloway stared at the Rain Street window of her ground-floor apartment. 3 years in this wheelchair. 3 years since the hit-and-run that shattered more than just her spine. It had broken her faith that justice existed in this world. Tonight, she'd sent another anonymous letter, another desperate attempt to shake loose the truth from the coward who'd left her bleeding on Highway 22. But Margaret had made a mistake. A simple clerical error that would change everything. The letter meant for businessman Robert Kane had found its way to Robert Caine, a bearded giant of a man who'd been hiding in the mountains since the night fire took his family. When Caine read those words, "I know what you did that night," 15 years of guilt crashed down on him like an avalanche. He believed this crippled woman somehow knew about his greatest failure, his most shameful secret. Now, as thunder rolls across the valley and Margaret sleeps fitfully in her bed, heavy boots approach her door. What happens when two broken souls, each carrying unbearable guilt, finally meet in the darkness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The clock on Margaret's nightstand glowed 2:47 a.m. when the first footstep creaked on her porch. In the haze between sleep and waking, she dismissed it as another branch falling from the massive Douglas fir that loomed over her apartment building. Cedar Falls collected storms the way other towns collected tourists, relentlessly and without much concern for the locals' comfort. But the second creak was deliberate, measured, human. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her journalist's instincts kicking in despite 3 years of forced retirement. She'd chosen this ground-floor unit specifically because it felt safer than being trapped upstairs in a wheelchair, but now that decision seemed catastrophically naive. Her fingers found the baseball bat she kept beside her bed, a cruel irony, since she could no longer stand to swing it properly. The footsteps circled her building once, then twice. Heavy boots on wet concrete, moving with the patience of someone who had all night and nothing left to lose. Margaret held her breath, listening to the rain mask the intruder's movements. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered the letter she'd sent earlier that evening. Dear Mr. Caine, I know what you did that night 3 years ago on Highway 22. I know you left that woman to die in the rain while you drove away like a coward. Your conscience must be eating you alive by now. Meet me at the Cedar Falls Diner tomorrow at noon if you want to discuss this like civilized people. If you don't show, I'll take what I know to the police. A concerned citizen. She'd been so careful with her previous letters, vague threats, fishing for reactions, hoping to catch someone in a lie. But tonight's message had been different. Bolder, more desperate. 3 years of dead ends and dismissive police reports had pushed her past caution into reckless territory. The footsteps stopped directly outside her front door. Margaret transferred herself into her wheelchair with practiced silence, grateful for the upper body strength she'd built through endless physical therapy sessions. She rolled toward the window, staying low, and peered through the gap in her blinds. A massive silhouette stood motionless on her porch, broad shoulders hunched against the rain. In the dim glow of the security light, she could make out a wild beard and hair that hadn't seen scissors in years. This wasn't Robert Caine, the smooth businessman who owned half the commercial properties in Cedar Falls. This was something else entirely, something that belonged in the wilderness, not on her doorstep at 3 in the morning. The man reached into his coat, and Margaret's breath caught. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out an envelope. Her envelope, she realized with growing horror. The one she'd addressed to Robert Caine. How had he gotten it? And who was he? The stranger stood there reading her letter by the pale light, his massive frame trembling with what might have been rage or grief or something worse. When he finished, he looked directly at her window, and Margaret jerked back from the blinds, her heart nearly stopping. Had he seen her? In the darkness of her apartment, surely she was invisible, but those eyes, even from this distance, she could feel the weight of them, the desperate intensity of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. 3 sharp knocks echoed through her apartment like gunshots. Margaret bit back a scream and rolled away from the door, her mind racing through options. Call 911? Her phone was in the bedroom. Try to escape through the back door. The wheelchair ramp only led to the front, confront him through the door, and hope he'd go away. That seemed like suicide. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Then a voice, rough and raw like gravel in a cement mixer, "Ma'am. I know you're in there. I got your letter." His accent carried the mountain drawl of someone who'd spent years talking only to trees and wildlife. Margaret had interviewed enough isolated witnesses during her journalism days to recognize the sound. This was a man who'd forgotten how to navigate normal human interaction. "I don't know what you think you know," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "But we need to talk. About that night. About what really happened." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. He was talking as if he'd been there, as if her wild guess about Robert Caine had somehow landed on the truth. But this wasn't Caine. So who was he, and how did he know about Highway 22? "Please," the voice continued, and now she could hear tears beneath the gravel. "I've been carrying this alone for so long. If you know about Sarah and Emma, about how I failed them, maybe you can help me understand why I deserved to live when they didn't." Sarah and Emma. Margaret's investigative mind latched onto those names like a drowning person grasping a lifeline. Those weren't the names of hit-and-run victims. She'd memorized every traffic fatality in the region going back 5 years. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. The doorknob rattled softly, testing whether it was locked. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that her anonymous letter had found its way to someone with blood on his hands. Just not the blood she'd been looking for. Margaret remained frozen in her wheelchair, listening to the silence that followed the doorknob's rattle. Minutes stretched like hours until she heard the heavy footsteps retreat, fading into the rain-soaked night. Even then, she waited another hour before daring to turn on a light, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. The police officer who answered her call sounded bored until she mentioned the stranger on her porch. When Margaret described the man, his size, his wild appearance, his reference to Sarah and Emma, she heard keyboards clicking in the background. "Ma'am, you said he mentioned those specific names?" Officer Martinez's voice had sharpened considerably. "We'll have a patrol car swing by, but I need you to be very careful. Lock your doors and don't answer them for anyone you don't know." "Who is he?" Margaret pressed, but the line had already gone dead. Sleep proved impossible. As dawn broke grey and reluctant over Cedar Falls, Margaret went through the motions of her morning routine with mechanical precision. Transfer to the shower chair, navigate the modified bathroom she'd had installed with her insurance settlement, dress in clothes that prioritized function over fashion. The normalcy of these actions felt surreal after the night's terror. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the toll of 3 sleepless years. At 47, Margaret looked older, silver threading through auburn hair she'd once worn long and professionally styled, now cropped short for convenience. The sharp cheekbones that had looked striking on camera were now gaunt, carved by chronic pain and bitter determination. Only her eyes remained unchanged, that piercing green that had once made interview subjects squirm with uncomfortable truths. By 7 a.m., she was at her kitchen table with coffee and her laptop, doing what she'd always done when the world stopped making sense: research. Sarah and Emma weren't common names together. A methodical search through regional newspaper archives, obituaries, missing persons reports, and accident databases took most of the morning. She found them buried in a 3-year-old story from the Bend Bulletin, a brief article that had run on page 6, "Mountain Family Dies in Cabin Fire." Sarah Caine, 34, and her daughter Emma, 8, had perished when their remote cabin in the Cascade National Forest caught fire during a winter storm. The sole survivor was Sarah's husband, Robert Kane, who had been trapped outside when the structure collapsed. Robert Caine. Not Caine, Caine. Margaret stared at the pixelated photograph accompanying the article. Even clean-shaven and civilized, The man bore a resemblance to her midnight visitor. The story was sparse on details, typical of rural tragedy reporting, but it mentioned that Caine had been hospitalized for severe burns and smoke inhalation trying to save his family. Her anonymous letter, meant for businessman Robert Caine, had been delivered to grieving widower Robert Caine instead, a simple postal error that had opened a wound she'd never intended to touch. The irony was suffocating. Here she was, a woman whose life had been destroyed by someone's moment of cowardice, accidentally tormenting a man whose life had been destroyed by his own helplessness. They were both casualties of different kinds of accidents, survivors carrying guilt that belonged to others. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carol in Portland lunch next week. "You never call anymore." The message sat unanswered. Carol's life, husband, kids, book club meetings, and soccer practices existed in a parallel universe Margaret could no longer access. Her sister's well-meaning invitations always came with an undercurrent of pity that made Margaret's teeth ache. She wheeled to her living room window and looked out at Cedar Falls Main Street. The town moved at its usual sleepy pace, morning commuters heading to jobs in larger cities, elderly residents walking dogs that moved as slowly as their owners, teenagers who couldn't wait to escape this place that Margaret had chosen for its very isolation. Before the accident, she'd lived in Portland's Pearl District, in a sleek condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a social calendar that required a color-coded planner. She'd covered city council corruption, environmental scandals, and corporate malfeasance for Oregon Public Radio. Her voice had been familiar to thousands of listeners who trusted her to ask the hard questions and find the uncomfortable truths. Now her world had shrunk to this accessible apartment with its wide doorways and lowered counters, this quiet town where she could disappear, and this obsessive hunt for the person who'd taken everything from her in a split second of cowardice. The hit and run had stolen more than her legs. It had taken her purpose, her identity, her faith that justice was possible in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to truth. The anonymous letters were all she had left, her only way of striking back at the darkness that had swallowed her life. But now, thinking of Robert Caine's broken voice pleading through her door, Margaret wondered if her quest for justice had transformed her into something she no longer recognized. The woman who'd built a career on seeking truth had become someone who fired accusations into the darkness, hoping to wound the right target. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Cascades, promising another long night of rain. The storm arrived with a vengeance that afternoon, turning Cedar Falls into a waterlogged ghost town. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the printout of the cabin fire article while rain hammered her windows like an angry fist. The photograph of Robert Caine, before grief had carved him into the wild creature who'd appeared on her porch, seemed to mock her from the page. She'd spent the morning crafting a dozen different apology letters in her mind, each one more inadequate than the last. How do you apologize for accidentally reopening someone else's deepest wound? How do you explain that your own pain had made you reckless enough to fire accusations at strangers? The afternoon news droned from her television, background noise she usually ignored, until a familiar name cut through her distraction. Search continues for Robert Caine, who disappeared from his mountain cabin sometime in the past week. Caine, the sole survivor of the tragic fire that claimed his wife and daughter 3 years ago, was reportedly struggling with severe depression and survivor's guilt. Margaret's blood turned to ice. The remote clicked off in her suddenly nerveless fingers as the implications crashed over her. The man who'd stood on her porch wasn't just grieving, he was actively missing, possibly suicidal, and her letter had somehow reached him in whatever dark place he'd retreated to. Her phone rang, shrill in the sudden silence. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Holloway?" The voice was gruff, professional. "This is Detective Ray Kowalski with the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office. I understand you had contact with Robert Caine last night?" Yes, he came to my door." Margaret's journalist instincts kicked in despite her shock. "How did you know?" "Your local police filed a report." "Ma'am, we need to talk. Caine has been missing for 5 days, and his mental state when he disappeared was concerning. Can you tell me exactly what he said to you? Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the raw desperation in Caine's voice, the way he'd pleaded about failing Sarah and Emma. He seemed to think I knew something about his family's death, about how he'd failed them. Detective, I sent him a letter by mistake. It was meant for someone else entirely. A long pause. What kind of letter? The moment of truth. Margaret could lie, deflect, keep her obsessive hunt for her hit-and-run driver private, but a man was missing, possibly dangerous to himself because of her mistake. I've been sending anonymous letters to men I think might have been involved in a hit-and-run accident 3 years ago. The letter was supposed to go to Robert Kane, the businessman, but somehow got delivered to Caine instead. Jesus Christ! Kowalski's voice dropped to a whisper. Ma'am, did you know that Caine has been telling people he's responsible for his family's death? That he could have saved them if he'd been stronger, faster, better? Your letter, if it accused him of leaving someone to die. Oh, God. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. I didn't know. I never meant... Ms. Holloway, I need you to listen very carefully. Caine has military training, survival skills, and nothing left to lose. If he thinks you have evidence that he's some kind of killer, he might see you as the only person who can either damn him or absolve him. Either way, that makes you very dangerous to be around. Through her living room window, Margaret caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line across the street. Just a shadow among the swaying branches, but something about it made her skin crawl. Detective, I think he might be watching my apartment. Get away from the windows. We're sending units now, but the storm is slowing us down. Do you have somewhere safe you can go? Margaret's mind raced through her limited options. Carol in Portland was 2 hours away in good weather. Friends from her old life who'd gradually stopped calling when her bitterness became too much to bear. The neighbors she'd deliberately kept at arm's length because closeness meant vulnerability, and she'd had enough vulnerability to last a lifetime. Miss Holloway, are you there? I'm here. I don't really have anywhere to... A sound cut through the storm's roar, not thunder, something deliberate and rhythmic. Footsteps on her porch, slow and measured, exactly like the night before. He's back, Margaret whispered into the phone. 3 knocks echoed through her apartment, followed by that gravel-rough voice. Ma'am, I know you're in there. I've been thinking about what you said, about that night, about justice. Maybe it's time we both got what we deserve. Margaret gripped her phone tighter, her other hand finding the baseball bat beside her chair. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, a broken man had decided that redemption could only be found in the place where his guilt had driven him. The choice crystallized before her with terrifying clarity: hide and hope the police arrived in time, or face the consequences of her letter and try to save them both. Margaret's hand trembled against the baseball bat's worn grip, her knuckles white in the dim light filtering through her blinds. The weight of Detective Kowalski's breathing filled her ear as the silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the storm's relentless assault on her building. Hide or face him. The choice seemed impossibly simple and terrifyingly complex all at once. Ma'am? Caine's voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. I know this is hard. I know you probably think I'm some kind of monster. But I've been alone with this for 3 years. And when I read your letter, it was like someone finally saw the truth about me. Margaret pressed her lips together to keep from responding. Every instinct she'd developed as an investigative journalist screamed at her to engage, to ask questions, to dig deeper into the story unfolding on her doorstep. But those same instincts had led her here, to this moment where her reckless pursuit of justice had endangered them both. The units are still 20 minutes out, Detective Kowalski whispered through the phone. Can you hold on that long? Don't engage with him. Just wait. 20 minutes. Margaret looked around her apartment, taking inventory of her limitations with brutal honesty. The wheelchair made her slower, more vulnerable. The modified layout gave her nowhere to hide that wasn't accessible to someone determined to find her. Her baseball bat was a pathetic defense against a man who'd survived 3 years alone in the wilderness. But worse than the physical disadvantages was the crushing weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She'd done this. Her obsession with finding her hit-and-run driver had led her to fire accusations into the darkness like bullets, not caring who might be caught in the crossfire. Now a grief-stricken man was standing in the rain, believing she held the key to his salvation or damnation. "I keep thinking about that night," Caine continued, and Margaret could hear him moving on the porch, pacing like a caged animal. "About the choices I made. Sarah told me not to go outside during the storm. The wind was making the trees dangerous, she said. But I heard something, maybe an animal in distress, and I thought I could help." Margaret closed her eyes, seeing the scene play out in her mind. A man stepping into a storm to help something suffering, leaving his family safe inside. The cruel irony of how quickly safety could become a death trap. "When the tree fell across the door, I was trapped outside for 40 minutes. Caine's voice cracked. 40 minutes of clawing at burning wood while they died in there. You want to know about leaving someone to die? I listened to my daughter calling for me, and I couldn't reach her." Tears stung Margaret's eyes. This was what her letter had stirred up. Not the guilt of a hit-and-run driver, but the anguish of a man who'd been punishing himself for being the victim of circumstance. She thought of her own accident, how the investigating officer had told her the same thing Detective Martinez had said tonight. Sometimes there was nothing anyone could have done. But knowing that and believing it were different things entirely. "Don't let him guilt you into opening that door." Kowalski's voice was sharp in her ear. "Unstable individuals often use emotional manipulation." "He's not manipulating anyone," Margaret whispered back, surprising herself with her certainty. "He's dying inside." Just like she was. Just like she had been for 3 years, ever since some stranger had decided her life was less important than avoiding consequences. The parallel was so clear it made her chest ache. Her phone buzzed with another text from Carol. "Call me. Worried about you." Her sister's timing was impossibly perfect and perfectly useless. What could Margaret say? That her quest for justice had led her to accidentally torture an innocent man? That she was trapped in her own apartment by the consequences of her bitterness? Carol lived in a world where problems had solutions, where talking things through and getting professional help could fix what was broken. Margaret had tried that world. Physical therapy, counseling, support groups full of people who spoke about moving forward and finding closure, as if trauma was just another life challenge to overcome with the right attitude. "Ma'am, I know you're scared," Caine said, his voice closer to the door now. "I'm scared too. I came down from the mountain because your letter was the first time someone acknowledged what I did, what I failed to do. Maybe if we both stop hiding." Margaret bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. The rational choice was obvious. Stay silent, wait for the police, let trained professionals handle a mentally unstable man. The choice that would keep her safe, keep her uninvolved, keep her exactly where she'd been for 3 years. But safety had become its own kind of prison, and Margaret was beginning to understand that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about recognition, about seeing and being seen in the darkness where guilt lived. The storm raged on, and Margaret remained frozen between fear and something that might have been hope. Margaret's fingers slowly loosened their grip on the baseball bat. The weight of it had been comforting, a barrier between her and the unknown, but now it felt like what it truly was, a weapon meant to hurt someone who was already bleeding. "Detective," she whispered into the phone. "I'm going to talk to him. Ms. Holloway. Don't you dare." She ended the call. The silence that followed felt like stepping off a cliff. 3 years of careful isolation, of controlled interactions and measured risks, dissolved in an instant. Margaret had built her entire post-accident life around avoiding moments exactly like this one, moments where she couldn't control the outcome, couldn't retreat to safety, couldn't choose who had access to her vulnerability. But sitting in her wheelchair, listening to a broken man plead through her door, she realized that safety had become another kind of death, The woman who'd once confronted corrupt politicians and corporate criminals had been reduced to someone who fired accusations from the shadows and hid behind locked doors. "Mr. Caine?" Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The pacing on her porch stopped immediately. "The letter you received. It wasn't meant for you. It was supposed to go to Robert Kane, the businessman." There was a mistake with the delivery. A long pause. When Caine spoke again, his voice was hollow with confusion. "A mistake? I've been sending anonymous letters to men I thought might have been involved in my hit-and-run accident, the one that put me in this wheelchair 3 years ago. Your name is similar to his, and somehow the postal service—" Margaret's voice trailed off as she heard how inadequate the explanation sounded. A simple clerical error that had torn open this man's barely healed wounds. You don't know anything about Sarah and Emma?" The devastation in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Margaret wheeled closer to the door, close enough that only a few inches of wood separated them. "I know they died in a fire. I know you tried to save them and couldn't, and I know that wasn't your fault. You don't understand." Caine's voice was thick with tears. "If I hadn't gone outside, if I'd stayed with them, if the person who hit me had stayed instead of driving away, maybe I'd still have my legs," Margaret interrupted. "If I'd left work 5 minutes later that night, maybe I'd never have been in their path. If. It's a word that can drive you insane if you let it." She pressed her palm against the cool wood of the door. On the other side she could hear Caine breathing, ragged and uneven. "Mr. Caine, I spent 3 years trying to find someone to blame for what happened to me, and you've spent 3 years blaming yourself for something that was beyond your control. Maybe we've both been looking in the wrong direction. The police are coming, aren't they?" His voice held no anger, only resignation. "Yes, but not because I think you're dangerous, because they're worried about you. Because a lot of people have been looking for you since you disappeared." Another long silence. Margaret could feel the weight of the choice hanging between them. Not just his choice about what to do next, but her own choice about how far into this darkness she was willing to venture. "I came down from the mountain to find answers," Caine said finally. "But maybe the answer is that some questions don't have good answers. Some guilt doesn't have an expiration date." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But carrying it alone doesn't make it any lighter, and tormenting yourself doesn't bring them back." She was talking to him, but she was also talking to herself, to the woman who'd spent 3 years poisoning herself with bitterness, who turned her search for justice into a weapon that wounded innocence. "Will you?" Caine's voice was barely audible over the storm. "Will you tell me about your accident, about what happened to you?" The request caught Margaret off guard. In 3 years, no one had simply asked her to tell the story, not her version of it, not the sanitized version she gave to therapists or the angry version she gave to detectives, but just the truth of what it felt like to have your life split into before and after by a stranger's moment of cowardice. "Yes," she heard herself say, "but not through a door, and not with you standing in the rain." Margaret reached for the deadbolt, her hand steady despite everything. Behind her, the warm light of her apartment waited, the safe space she'd constructed to protect herself from exactly this kind of unpredictable human connection. Ahead of her lay the unknown territory of 2 damaged people trying to find meaning in their shared understanding of loss. She turned the lock and opened the door. Robert Caine stood in her doorway like a figure carved from shadow and rain. Up close, Margaret could see the toll 3 years of isolation had taken. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had forgotten how to carry weight, and his eyes held the particular emptiness that came from staring too long into the abyss of self-recrimination. "Come in," she said, wheeling backward to give him space. "Before we both catch pneumonia." He hesitated on the threshold, water dripping from his beard onto her hardwood floor. "You sure? Once I cross this line, you can't take it back. Can't pretend this conversation never happened." Margaret almost smiled at that. He was trying to protect her from a choice she'd already made the moment she opened the door. "I stopped pretending a long time ago, Mr. Caine. It's exhausting." He stepped inside, and Margaret was struck by how carefully he moved. Not the predatory caution of someone planning violence, but the delicate movements of someone who'd learned that the world was full of fragile things he might accidentally break, including himself. "Your apartment," he said, scanning the modified layout with practiced efficiency. "You've made it work for you." The observation carried no pity, which surprised her. Most people's first reaction to her space was either aggressive cheerfulness about her adaptation or uncomfortable avoidance of the obvious accommodations. Caine simply noted her reality the way he might note the weather, as something that existed and had to be factored into the equation of living. "Necessity makes good engineers," Margaret said, closing the door behind him but leaving it unlocked. The sound of sirens was still distant, muffled by the storm, but she could feel time pressing against them like a physical weight. "Sit wherever you're comfortable. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Something dry to wear?" Caine remained standing, arms loose at his sides. "Ma'am, I need you to understand something before those police get here. I'm not safe to be around right now. Haven't been for a while." The admission hung between them with terrible honesty. Margaret recognized the warning for what it was, not a threat, but a confession, the desperate transparency of someone who'd run out of ways to lie to himself about his mental state. "Are you planning to hurt me?" she asked directly. "No." The answer came without hesitation. "But I'm not planning much of anything these days. That's the problem." Margaret nodded, understanding flooding through her. She knew that particular kind of danger, not the explosive violence of anger, but the slow dissolution of caring whether you lived or died. The creeping numbness that made everything feel hypothetical, including consequences. "After my accident," she said, wheeling over to her kitchen area, "I spent about 6 months thinking the world would be better off without me taking up space in it. Not actively suicidal, just absent, like I was already gone and just hadn't gotten the memo yet." She put the kettle on, the familiar ritual giving her hands something to do while her mind navigated this unprecedented territory. "My sister Carol used to call 3 times a day during that period, not to check if I was okay, we both knew I wasn't, but to make sure I was still answering the phone." Behind her, she heard the soft creak of her couch springs as Caine finally sat down. "What changed? What brought you back?" Margaret considered the question while measuring coffee into the French press. What had changed? Not the circumstances of her accident. She was still paralyzed, still dependent on wheels and modifications and other people's patience. The hit-and-run driver was still out there, still free, still completely unaware that their moment of cowardice had shattered someone's life. "Anger," she said finally, surprising herself with the honesty. "I got tired of being sad and decided to be furious instead. Traded one kind of poison for another, but at least anger felt like motion. And now? Now." Margaret poured hot water over the coffee grounds, watching them bloom and swirl in the glass cylinder. Now she was sitting in her apartment with a stranger who'd been accidentally caught in the crossfire of her 3-year war against helplessness. Now she was waiting for police to arrive and wondering if she'd saved a life or simply delayed an inevitable tragedy. "Now I'm starting to think maybe fury and despair aren't the only options," she said, turning her wheelchair to face him. "Maybe there's something else we haven't tried yet." The sirens were getting closer, their wail cutting through the storm's white noise. Caine's head tilted toward the sound, but he didn't move to leave. "They'll want to take me back to the hospital," he said quietly. "Psych hold, probably. Medication and group therapy and people asking me how I'm processing my trauma. Would that be so terrible? Would it help if someone locked you up and told you to stop looking for your hit-and-run driver? Told you to just accept what happened and move on?" The question landed like a physical blow. Margaret stared at him, seeing herself reflected in his hollow-eyed determination to carry his pain alone. The sirens were almost at her door now. The sirens cut off abruptly, leaving only the storm's percussion against Margaret's windows. Through the thin curtains, she could see the wash of red and blue light painting her walls in alternating colors, the visual language of crisis and intervention. Last chance, Caine said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I can walk out there, let them handle this the way they're trained to. Clean and simple. Margaret's grip tightened on the wheels of her chair. Clean and simple. The same words her physical therapist had used about her recovery timeline, her sister used about moving forward, her former editor used about finding closure. As if trauma followed a prescription, as if healing could be scheduled and managed like any other project. Or, she asked, or you let me stay until we finish what we started. Let me tell you about Sarah and Emma, and you tell me about your accident. Two people who understand what it means to be broken, talking to each other instead of to professionals, who've never had their lives split in half. The weight of the choice settled around them. Outside, she could hear car doors slamming, the muffled voices of officers coordinating their approach. Protocol demanded they secure the scene, assess the threat, protect the victim. Everything Margaret had called them to do. But sitting across from Caine, watching him hold himself together through sheer will while waiting for her answer, Margaret realized she wasn't sure anymore who the victim was in this scenario. The woman who'd spent 3 years firing accusations into the darkness? The man who'd been accidentally caught in that crossfire? Or both of them, trapped in separate prisons of guilt and grief, finally seeing another human being who understood the weight of carrying unbearable responsibility? They won't just let you stay, she said practically. They'll want to talk to you, evaluate your mental state, probably insist on taking you somewhere for observation. I know. Caine leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with desperate intensity. But you called them, they'll listen to you. If you tell them I'm not a threat, that we're just talking. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Police, Miss Holloway, are you all right in there? Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. 3 years of careful isolation had led to this moment, a choice between safety and connection, between protocol and possibility. She thought of Carol's worried texts, of Detective Kowalski's warnings about emotional manipulation, of every reasonable voice that would tell her to let the professionals handle this damaged man. Then she looked at Caine, really looked at him. Beneath the wild hair and hollow cheeks, she saw something she recognized from her own mirror, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a war against themselves for so long, they'd forgotten what peace might look like. Miss Holloway. The voice was more insistent now. We need to know you're safe. I'm fine, she called back, her decision crystallizing as the words left her mouth. Mr. Caine is here with me. We're just talking. Ma'am, we need you to come to the door so we can see you're unharmed. Margaret looked at Caine, who had gone very still on her couch. Trust me, she said quietly. Then louder. I'm in a wheelchair, officers. It takes me a moment to get to the door, and Mr. Caine isn't holding me against my will or threatening me in any way. He's a man who received one of my letters by mistake, and we're trying to sort out the confusion. She could hear the officers conferring outside, their voices too low to make out words, but the tone suggesting debate about procedure versus the civilians' stated wishes. Caine was staring at her with something approaching wonder. Why? He asked simply. Margaret considered the question while the police discussed their options on the other side of her door. Why was she protecting a stranger who'd terrified her an hour ago? Why was she risking her safety for someone whose mental state was clearly fragile? Why was she choosing the complicated path when the simple one was right there waiting? Because, she said finally, 3 years ago, someone made a choice to drive away instead of staying to face the consequences of what they'd done. And I've spent every day since then wishing just once, someone would choose to stay and deal with the hard thing instead of running away. Caine's breath caught. Even if staying makes everything more complicated. Especially then. Margaret moved her wheelchair closer to the door, preparing to navigate what would undoubtedly be a delicate conversation with officers who were trained to see his presence as a threat rather than a chance at mutual understanding. Miss Holloway. The voice outside carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to talking people through crisis situations. We're going to need to speak with both of you. Can you open the door? Margaret reached for the handle. knowing that once she opened it, everything would change. The quiet sanctuary of shared understanding she and Caine had built in her living room would be invaded by questions, procedures, and the well-meaning machinery of crisis intervention. But maybe that was okay. Maybe healing wasn't supposed to happen in isolation. She turned the handle and opened the door to whatever came next. The ordeal begins. 2 officers stood in the doorway, their presence transforming Margaret's small apartment into something that felt like a crime scene. The older one, a woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much, took in the scene with professional efficiency, Margaret in her wheelchair, positioned protectively between the door and Caine, who sat motionless on the couch like a man waiting for execution. "I'm Officer Martinez," the woman said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to de-escalate volatile situations. "This is Officer Chen. We received reports of a disturbance." Behind Martinez, Chen, younger, tenser, kept his hand resting casually near his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation deteriorated. His eyes stayed locked on Caine, cataloguing potential threats, the wild appearance, the stillness that could explode into violence, the way he held himself like someone with nothing left to lose. "There's no disturbance now," Margaret said, hating how her voice sounded thin and defensive. "Mr. Caine received one of my letters by mistake. We were just clearing up the confusion." Martinez stepped inside without invitation, her presence filling the space with authority. "Mr. Caine, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them and answer a few questions." Caine complied, placing his palms flat on his knees. "Yes, ma'am. Are you Robert Caine, the man we've had a missing person report on for the past 6 months?" "I'm not missing," Caine said quietly. "I know exactly where I've been. Your brother filed the report after you stopped responding to his letters. He was worried you might have harmed yourself." Margaret watched Caine's face close down at the mention of his brother, saw him retreat behind walls she was only beginning to understand. This was what she'd been trying to prevent, the reduction of a complex human being to a case file, a problem to be managed and processed. "My mental state isn't a crime," Caine said. "No, but trespassing is," Chen interjected from the doorway. "Miss Holloway called in a prowler report, said someone was trying to break into her apartment." The words hit Margaret like cold water. Had she said that? In her panic, had she really used those words to describe what happened? She tried to remember the phone call, but fear had blurred the details. "I may have been unclear in my initial report," she said carefully. "Mr. Caine knocked on my door. He didn't try to break in." Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. "You called 911 because someone knocked on your door." The skepticism in her tone made Margaret's cheeks burn. How could she explain that a knock at 3 a.m. had felt like violence itself? That 3 years of isolation had turned normal human interaction into something threatening and alien. "I was frightened," she said simply. "It's been a long time since anyone came to my door unexpectedly." "Miss Holloway," Martinez said, her voice gentling slightly, "I need you to be honest with me. Are you afraid of Mr. Caine right now? Has he threatened you or made you feel unsafe in any way?" Margaret felt the weight of the question settle around her like a physical thing. One word, yes, would end this conversation. Caine would be taken away, evaluated, processed through the system designed to handle broken people who couldn't handle themselves. She would be safe in her apartment again, protected from the messy complications of human connection. But looking at Caine, seeing the resignation already settling into his posture as he prepared for inevitable disappointment, Margaret realized that safety wasn't the most important thing in the room anymore. "No," she said firmly, "I'm not afraid of him." Chen stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, with respect, you called us because you were terrified. Now you're saying you're fine. Which is it?" "Both," Margaret said, surprising herself with the honesty. "I was terrified when he first arrived because I didn't understand why he was here. But now I do understand, and I'm not afraid anymore." "Understanding doesn't make someone less dangerous," Martinez pointed out. "Mr. Caine, You've been living alone in the wilderness for 3 years. You're clearly in emotional distress. These aren't ideal conditions for making rational decisions. Caine's hands tightened on his knees, but his voice remained steady. What would you have me do? Pretend I'm fine? Pretend I don't wake up every morning wishing I'd died in that fire with them? The raw honesty in his words created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Margaret could see Martinez and Chen exchanging glances, conducting some form of professional communication about how to proceed with a man who was clearly suicidal but hadn't actually committed any crime. Mr. Caine, Martinez said finally, I think you need to come with us. Let someone help you work through whatever you're dealing with. No. The word came from Margaret's mouth before she'd consciously decided to speak. He stays here. With me. The room went dead quiet, except for the storm still raging outside. Margaret could feel everyone staring at her, the officers with professional concern, Caine with desperate gratitude, and realized she'd just made the most dangerous decision of her life. But for the first time in 3 years, dangerous felt like living. Martinez's expression hardened. Miss Holloway, I don't think you understand the situation you're putting yourself in. I understand perfectly, Margaret said, though her voice wavered slightly. Mr. Caine is a grieving man who received my letter by mistake. He's not a criminal. Chen stepped fully into the apartment now, his patience exhausted. Ma'am, you can't just decide to harbor someone who's clearly having a mental health crisis. There are protocols. Protocols for what? Margaret's voice rose. For a man who's committed no crime except being sad. For someone who's been living peacefully in the mountains for 3 years without bothering anyone. Until tonight, Martinez pointed out. When he showed up at your door at 3 a.m. because of some letter you sent. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret felt the first crack in her resolve as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. Her anonymous letters, her private war against the unknown driver who'd destroyed her life, had pulled an innocent man from his self-imposed exile and thrust him into this nightmare. What kind of letter? Chen asked, pulling out his notepad. Margaret's throat went dry. She couldn't explain about the letters without admitting to what might be considered harassment. Couldn't tell them about her 3-year campaign of accusations against men she suspected of hit and run without revealing how far beyond reason her quest for justice had taken her. It was... She began, then faltered. She thought I was someone else, Caine said quietly. Someone who hurt her. Martinez turned her attention back to him. And you decided the appropriate response was to track her down in the middle of the night? I thought she knew about my family, Caine said, his voice barely audible. About the night they died. I needed to understand how she knew. What happened to your family, Mr. Caine? Margaret watched Caine's face crumble as he was forced to put his private anguish into words for strangers with clipboards and radios. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Their shared understanding, the delicate connection they'd built over the past hour, was being dissected under fluorescent authority. House fire, Caine whispered. 15 years ago. I was supposed to check the heating system that week, but I kept putting it off. When the fire started, I couldn't get to them in time. Chen was writing everything down, reducing tragedy to data points. And you've been living alone in the wilderness since then? 3 years. Since my brother stopped asking questions about why I wasn't getting better. Martinez's expression softened slightly, but her professional resolve remained firm. Mr. Caine, I've seen a lot of people dealing with survivor's guilt. Living in isolation isn't helping you heal. It's making everything worse. Maybe some things aren't supposed to heal, Caine said. That's exactly the kind of thinking that worries us, Chen interjected. Along with the fact that you tracked down a disabled woman in the middle of the night because you misunderstood a letter. Margaret flinched at the clinical way he described her. A disabled woman, a victim. Someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. The familiar sting of being reduced to her limitations, rather than seen as a complete person making her own choices. I asked him to stay, she said firmly. Miss Holloway, Martinez said, her voice taking on the patient tone reserved for people not thinking clearly. You've been living alone for 3 years. You're isolated, probably lonely. It's natural to feel a connection with someone who seems to understand your pain, but that doesn't mean it's safe or healthy. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Lonely, isolated. Not thinking clearly, all true, but hearing them spoken aloud by a stranger made her realize how her decision looked from the outside, a desperate woman clinging to the first person who'd shown her genuine understanding in years. "We can't force you to press charges," Chen continued. "But we also can't leave someone in mental distress unsupervised with a vulnerable civilian." "I'm not vulnerable," Margaret protested. But even as she said it, she could hear how hollow the words sounded. She was exactly vulnerable, trapped in a wheelchair, alone, so starved for connection that she was protecting a stranger who'd terrified her hours earlier. "Mr. Caine," Martinez said, "you have 2 choices. You can come with us voluntarily for evaluation and assistance, or we can initiate an involuntary psychiatric hold. Either way, you're not staying here." Margaret watched 3 years of careful control crumble around her. Her anonymous letters had finally brought someone to her door, but not the person she'd been hunting. Instead, she'd accidentally destroyed the peace of an innocent man and proven that she was exactly what everyone suspected, a bitter, isolated woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted. "Please," she said, though she wasn't sure who she was asking or what she was asking for. Caine stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "It's all right," he told her. "You tried. That's more than anyone else has done." As he walked toward the officers, Margaret realized she was about to lose the first real connection she'd felt in 3 years, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it.